There are some things a person should forget, but this was not one of them. It was the winter of 1911, in the deep, humid shadows of the Louisiana bayou. In quiet railroad towns like Lafayette, Crowley, and Rayne, life was slow, hard, and built on a deep sense of community. When the sun went down, people pulled their shutters, bolted their doors, and went to sleep feeling perfectly safe. But soon, the mornings began to bring something unimaginable. Picture this. It's the quietest hour of dawn. A neighbor notices that the house next door is entirely too still. There is no smoke rising from the chimney, no children playing in the front yard. When local police finally break down the door, a door that is almost always locked from the inside, they are met with a nightmare. Entire families, fathers, mothers, and small children slaughtered in their beds. And the most terrifying part of it all? The silence. There was never a single scream heard by the neighbors. No dogs barking in the night. No signs of a desperate struggle. It was as if a phantom had slipped right through the walls, silencing the victims before they ever knew there was a monster in the room. The weapon of choice was brutally simple. A heavy wood-chopping axe, often belonging to the family themselves, left behind at the scene, resting near the bed in a pool of blood. But whoever was doing this wasn't looking for money. Valuables, coins, and personal items were left sitting in plain sight, completely untouched. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't a simple home invasion. It was something entirely different. It was organized. It was ritualistic. As the body count climbed across the South, eventually reaching over 35 victims in a matter of months, a suffocating panic set in. Whole towns were terrified. Men stayed up all night, sleeping with shotguns across their laps. Rumors exploded that a secret voodoo cult, calling themselves the Church of Sacrifice, was butchering families to gain supernatural powers and immortality. But when the authorities finally cornered a suspect, the reality of who was holding the axe was somehow more chilling than any ghost story. The person who eventually stood before a judge, smiling as the gruesome details of the impossible locked-room murders were read aloud, wasn't a massive, hardened serial killer. It was a quiet, unassuming 17-year-old girl named Clementine Barnabet. And the truth is, it should never have happened. To understand how a nightmare of this magnitude could unfold, you have to understand the world where it happened. Welcome to Lafayette, Louisiana, in 1911. If you looked at the postcards from that era, you would see a picture of Southern peace. Sweeping sugarcane fields, stretching out under the heavy summer sun. Ancient oak trees, dripping with Spanish moss. Small, tight-knit agricultural towns connected by a growing web of railroad tracks. For the people living here, life was simple, and it was entirely centered around two things: hard work and deep faith. On Sundays, the wooden pews of the local churches were packed. Neighbors knew each other by name. They shared meals, helped harvest each other's crops, and looked after one another's children. In these rural communities, the concept of a stranger barely existed. People trusted their neighbors so implicitly that locking a front door was considered an insult. But that sense of safety was an illusion. Behind the peaceful facade of Sunday sermons and quiet country nights, there was a harsh, unforgiving reality. This was the Jim Crow South. The communities targeted by the Phantom Killer were almost entirely African American families, tenant farmers, and sharecroppers, who spent their days doing backbreaking labor in the sweltering cotton and sugar fields just to survive. These families didn't live in grand, secure houses. They lived in small, fragile, wooden shacks, often pushed to the very edges of town. And almost all of these homes sat just a few dozen feet away from the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks. That location wasn't just a detail. It was a death sentence. When the massive, steam-powered trains roared through these small towns at night, the ground shook. The wooden walls of the shacks rattled. The deafening noise of the engines was so loud that it completely swallowed up any other sound. A heavy footstep on the porch, the splintering of a wooden doorframe, the desperate cries of a terrified family, all of it was violently erased by the passing trains. The killer knew exactly what they were doing. They were hunting people who were already marginalized, isolated, and living in homes that offered absolutely no physical protection. These families were utterly defenseless, left exposed in the dark while the rest of the world looked the other way. This wasn't a paradise. It was the perfect hunting ground. A place where a predator could step right out of the dark swamps, shatter a family, and vanish back into the shadows without anyone noticing until the sun came up. From the outside, everything looked right, but something was already wrong. The victims in these attacks were not outlaws or dangerous people living on the edge of society. They were ordinary, highly respectable families. Take the Byers family in Crowley, or the Andrus and Randall families over in Lafayette. These were good, hard-working folks. They were devoted mothers, exhausted fathers, and innocent children. Many of them were deeply involved in their local congregations. They were the kind of neighbors who shared their harvest, people who simply wanted to raise their kids and live a quiet life. They ate dinner together, they prayed together, and they went to sleep under the same roof. But the phantom moving through the dark did not care about their goodness. When night fell, those peaceful, humble homes were turned into unimaginable nightmares. Whole generations were wiped away in a single, brutal evening. The killer spared absolutely no one, not the strong fathers, not the sleeping mothers, and not even the youngest babies resting in their cribs. The sheer, cold cruelty of the violence left these small towns completely paralyzed by a freezing, breathless terror. The tight bonds of trust that held these communities together began to violently shatter. People started looking at their friends and neighbors with deep suspicion. And right in the middle of that shattering trust was Clementine Barnabet. If you had walked past Clementine on a dusty Lafayette street, you would not have looked twice at her. She was only 17 years old. By all accounts, she was a quiet, polite, and reserved teenager. She worked as a live-in housekeeper, folding laundry and sweeping floors for families right there in the neighborhood. She was known as a highly religious girl, even serving as a deaconess in her local church. To the outside world, her public face was completely unassuming. She seemed perfectly harmless, but beneath that calm, everyday smile, a dark and terrifying obsession was taking root. Away from the safe, sunlit church pews, Clementine was deeply wrapped up in something far more tempting. She spoke in hushed whispers about a secret, bloodthirsty cult she called the Church of Sacrifice. While her neighbors desperately prayed for safety from the axe murderer, Clementine was holding onto a voodoo conjure bag, a dark magic charm supposedly given to her by a local priestess. Clementine truly believed this small bag made her completely invincible. She believed it granted her supernatural protection and absolute immortality. While she politely nodded to the people she passed during the day, her mind was consumed by a chilling, twisted delusion. She believed she was a chosen instrument, guided by unseen forces to carry out unspeakable, ritualistic violence. The contrast is almost too hard to process. It is a terrifying reality. To look into the eyes of a quiet, polite teenage girl and never realize the pure, cold danger standing right inside your own home. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone and later realized you never really knew them at all? If that's ever happened to you, just take a second and let me know in the comments. By the winter of 1911, the fear wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was a physical weight pressing down on the state of Louisiana. The brutal, unpredictable slaughter had completely paralyzed these once welcoming towns. Panic took over. Local sheriffs and mayors were forced to take drastic measures just to keep people from fleeing. Strict curfews were ordered. The very second the sun dipped below the horizon, the streets went dead empty. Men formed heavily armed vigilante committees, patrolling the dark dirt roads with rifles and glowing lanterns, jumping at every shifting shadow. The heavy, suffocating dread fractured the community. Nobody knew who the monster was, or whose door would be broken down next. Then, the authorities caught a break that defied all logic. Acting on a mix of local tips and growing suspicion, law enforcement searched the living quarters of that quiet, 17-year-old girl, Clementine Barnabet. Tucked away in her room, investigators uncovered something horrifying. A garment stained deeply with dried human blood. It was the solid, physical proof they had been desperately hunting for. But what happened next was even more shocking than the gruesome discovery itself. When confronted by hardened detectives, Clementine didn't panic. She didn't cry, scream, or beg for mercy like an innocent teenager caught in a nightmare. Instead, she looked right at the officers, and she smiled. Without a single ounce of hesitation, she opened her mouth and willingly began to confess. Her words flowed freely, pouring out a sick, sprawling tale of carnage. With chilling, mechanical calmness, she detailed the midnight attacks. She didn't just admit to a few crimes. She proudly claimed responsibility for leading the bloodbath, eventually tying herself to over 35 murders. She wasn't ashamed. She was boasting. She spoke of her victims not as human beings, but as necessary offerings for her dark congregation. For the grown men sitting across from her, the absolute lack of emotion in her eyes was entirely paralyzing. They had caught the phantom, and she was happy to be found. That was the moment. Everything began to move. A sound, then another, then silence. Picture lying in your own bed. The humid Louisiana night is thick, pushing against the window panes. The room is completely dark. The only thing you can hear is the soft, rhythmic breathing of your kids sleeping right across the hall. You are in your safest place. But just outside, a figure detaches from the swampy tree line. Footsteps creep up to the back porch. A wooden latch is slowly pried open. A floorboard groans under the weight of a silent intruder slipping into the narrow hallway. The killer rarely brought a weapon. They didn't need to. They simply picked up the family's own wood-chopping axe from the yard. The exact same tool the father used to split firewood and keep his house warm was about to destroy his entire world. The shadow steps into the bedroom. The solid iron blade is lifted high above the mattress. Then comes the devastating strike. The violence was swift, merciless, and absolute. Skulls were shattered before the victims could even open their eyes to see who was standing over them. Blood soaked deep into handmade quilts. There was no chance to fight back, no time to scream. In some of these houses, the intruder calmly took the time to cover the mirrors with cloth, a chilling old superstition to keep the dead from trapping the living soul. Then, they would carefully lock the doors from the inside, leaving the bloody, heavy tool resting right next to the ruined bodies before melting back into the night. But the most gut-wrenching part of this nightmare wasn't just the gore. It was the sickening betrayal. The monster gripping that wooden handle wasn't a towering, faceless madman drifting through town. It was a teenager, a girl from the neighborhood. Someone who smiled politely at these exact same people during church gatherings. Clementine Barnabet walked into the sacred, private sanctuaries of her own community and butchered them without a drop of mercy. She swung that heavy metal into the faces of sleeping toddlers and exhausted mothers, completely convinced she was doing them a favor. She believed her gruesome sacrifices were sending them to a twisted version of heaven while securing her own dark immortality. It was the ultimate betrayal, a youth, slaughtering her own people and leaving behind nothing but broken homes and a deafening, tragic silence. The confession was supposed to bring peace. It was supposed to close the book on the nightmare. But instead, it blew the doors wide open to a reality far more terrifying. When Clementine began whispering about her church of sacrifice, the investigation immediately spiraled into absolute chaos. This wasn't just a single disturbed teenager anymore. The panicked public now believed a sprawling, organized cult was operating right under their noses, hunting in the dark. Deep, superstitious terror gripped the Louisiana swamps. People were no longer just afraid of the axe. They were terrified of dark voodoo rituals, blood oaths, and immortality charms bought with innocent lives. Law enforcement was entirely out of their depth. They were local detectives trying to solve a physical crime, and suddenly they were fighting an invisible ghost story. Desperate to stop the panic, police started arresting anyone. Clementine pointed a finger at local workers, fathers, and ordinary men whose lives were shattered simply because a smiling 17-year-old girl spoke their names. But then came the most chilling twist of the entire investigation. A detail so shocking it paralyzed the authorities. Even after Clementine Barnabet was locked securely inside a jail cell, the brutal axe murders did not stop. Families were still being slaughtered in the dead of night. The exact same methods, the exact same silence. This impossible reality split the public down the middle, leaving historians and detectives wrestling with a twisted, dual perspective that remains unsolved today. Was Clementine truly the evil mastermind she claimed to be? Was she the charismatic, commanding leader of a bloodthirsty sect, pulling the strings from behind bars while her loyal followers carried out her gruesome orders? Or was it all a massive, manipulative lie? Was she just a deeply troubled girl acting as a willing scapegoat, spinning a web of deceit to build her own terrifying legend? Many began to suspect she was simply taking credit for the horrific work of an entirely different, unseen serial killer roaming the Jim Crow South. Every time detectives pushed her for facts, her story shifted. The truth became a tangled, slippery mess, buried under layers of false confessions and misplaced blame. Take a moment and think about this. If you were in that situation, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent or told the truth, even if it destroyed everything? I really want to hear your thoughts. In the end, the justice system simply didn't know what to do with a teenage monster. Faced with a dizzying web of lies and the heavy, undeniable weight of the bodies, the courts made their final move. Clementine Barnabet stood before a judge and officially confessed to the brutal slaughter of 35 human beings. 35 mothers, fathers, and sleeping children. For a bloodbath that massive, you would expect the ultimate punishment. But she somehow escaped the hangman's noose. Instead, she was handed a life sentence and shipped away to the notorious Louisiana State Penitentiary, a brutal, sweltering prison farm widely known as Angola. The grieving towns finally exhaled. The heavy iron doors slammed shut. The monster was securely in a cage. The nightmare was supposed to be over forever, but it wasn't. What happened next is the most deeply unsettling part of this entire dark saga. Clementine Barnabet did not rot in a cold cell for the rest of her days. She barely served 10 short years. According to historical records, while locked inside the prison walls, the young woman underwent a mysterious medical procedure. Reports from the time described it as a surgery to relieve pressure on her brain, a bizarre operation that prison doctors claimed miraculously cured her of her violent, murderous urges. With the stroke of a pen and a highly questionable medical diagnosis, the state of Louisiana decided this mass killer was suddenly safe for society. In August of 1923, the towering gates of Angola swung wide open. Clementine, now 29 years old, quietly walked out into the warm southern sun. A woman who proudly admitted to wiping out entire generations was just handed her freedom, and then she vanished completely. She slipped away into the vast, bustling crowds of America and was never seen or heard from again. No census records, no marriage license, no death certificate, no grave. She became an absolute ghost. The terrifying reality is that she simply walked away. She could have easily changed her name, moved to a new city, and lived right next door to anyone. She might have attended a new church, folded laundry on a new porch, and smiled sweetly at her neighbors, completely hiding the unspeakable horror resting just beneath her skin. There is no neat, comforting bow to tie up this tragedy. No final justice for the innocent families resting beneath the Louisiana dirt. In the end, the truth didn't disappear. It just stopped being spoken. God help us all. History is full of ghosts like Clementine, dark corners, true crimes that were quietly buried to protect the illusion of safety. But these stories still echo in the dark, and they deserve to be brought into the light. We cannot let them be forgotten. If you are drawn to the historical true crime stories that defy belief, please subscribe to the channel. Join us, because the past is never really dead. It's just waiting for someone brave enough to listen.